She was a beautiful young woman, inside and out.
She was always trying to help people.
She was going places.
Until her sudden disappearance sets off red flags.
I didn't see the car.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning. She should be in bed.
Something was wrong.
Yasmin, it's Mom. Where are you?
Hey!
Had she given up everything to follow her heart?
He's the love of her life.
She wanted to be with him.
She went with him down to Mexico.
Or had she gotten in too deep to ever come back home?
He was very jealous, overall just controlling.
What did you just say to me?
I know that she believes that he is capable of hurting her.
Police located the vehicle partially burned.
My heart sank because if she wasn't in the car, where's my daughter?
There's hair. It's a body. There's hair.
April 15th, 2022. It's just before sunup in Albuquerque, New Mexico's largest city.
It's a big town with a small town feeling.
There's a lot of different cultures, a lot of ethnicities. It's a melting pot.
But the unfortunate truth about Albuquerque is that there is a lot of crime here.
At around 4 a.m., one resident, Yvonne Jaramillo, wakes up in her trailer on the city's south side.
Yvonne hears her son. He has a bad dream. She goes and checks on him.
He was crying in his sleep, so I comforted him and, made him go back to sleep.
As she's headed back to her bedroom, as any mother would, hey, why don't I check on my daughter?
I saw her door was a little open, which she never left her door open. I knocked.
Yasmin?
Then I looked in there.
But Yasmin is not in her bed.
Of course, Yvonne grows concerned.
She left everything. Her purse was there. She wouldn't go out without her purse.
Yvonne then realizes that the hook where she usually hangs the car keys, there are no keys there.
I looked out the window and I didn't see the car.
So, Yvonne makes a worried call to her daughter.
Yasmin, it's Mom. Where are you?
20-year-old Yasmin Marquez always wanted the best for the people around her.
She was a very happy person, a hard worker, always trying to help people.
She was always supportive in the house. She was a great daughter, just such a beautiful person.
Like my son says, she was the best big sister ever.
And she was equally beautiful on the outside.
Her passion was makeup. She just loved doing makeup.
Her friends convinced her that this was her thing, and she started an Instagram page to kind of show off what she could do. At a certain point, her Instagram blew up. She got PR packages, and this became her thing.
But Yasmin was more than just a pretty face.
She was a young lady who was going places.
She was working on a career in nursing. She was going to the community college. She had a lot on her plate, and she was handling it all.
Yasmin studied hard, but also kept up her social life. And in the summer of 2021, she met a young man named Jonathan Martinez.
They did meet on social media. He had been trying for over a year to get her attention.
He was always dropping into her DMs, trying to make a love connection, but she initially wasn't interested.
Then one day, Yasmin decided, I'm going to see what this is about. And she reached out to him.
Hey!
Hi. So what made you change your mind?
curiosity, I guess.
Jonathan seemed like a very nice guy. He presented well.
It wasn't long before the two were an item.
She was really happy.
She truly believed that he was the one for her.
They got so serious that Jonathan gave Yasmin this promise ring.
That meant a lot for him to give her one of his rings.
This sort of really cemented their relationship, and they began talking about marriage.
But now Yasmin's mother has awakened in the middle of the night to find her daughter's bed empty and her car gone.
I got worried and I was trying to call and text her and no answer. I was like, okay, something's not right because she always picks up.
Yvonne calls everywhere, searching frantically for her daughter. She calls her friends, anyone who can put her in contact with her daughter.
Her fear mounting, she wakes up her husband, Jesus.
Wake up.
I said, Yasmin's not here, the car's not here, and that she's not picking up the phone.
Okay. That's when Yvonne and her husband decide to call police.
I'm calling because my daughter's missing. I think she's in trouble.
Initially, the parents are telling police, hey, look, this is our daughter. We know she would never just up and go away. You gotta take this seriously.
We have many shows with the friend. We can't find her.
But could there be a simple explanation for her sudden disappearance?
Yasmin is an adult, and it's not even been 24 hours yet.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of reasons why people go missing, and sometimes people go missing voluntarily.
But they are like, no, this is a problem, something is wrong. And mom starts to talk.
She starts to tell the operator about Yasmin's boyfriend.
He's very dangerous. He's actually wanted for that downtown shooting.
"20-year-old Yasmin Marquez was making big plans.
She's pursuing nursing, she's doing her makeup thing. She's talking about marriage with her boyfriend.
This future was just so bright for her.
But now, after Yasmin disappeared in the middle of the night, her parents have called the police.
They're afraid she's gone to see her boyfriend, Jonathan Martinez, who they feel is dangerous.
According to family, Jonathan is wanted for a shooting.
They shot a teenager.
That got police attention.
He was alleged to have been the driver of a vehicle that was involved in the shooting.
Police are well aware of this shooting.
It left a 19-year-old teenager dead and a 16-year-old wounded.
19-year-old Trevante Robbins died at the scene.
Robbins had been in town for the 4th of July and had decided to meet up with a friend before a party.
But they never made it.
They're hanging out, and this black car just starts circling them. And all of a sudden, somebody puts a gun out and starts shooting.
Robbins was shot in the face and died instantly. And a 16-year-old companion was hit in the abdomen.
Luckily, he survives.
Homicide detectives were able to locate surveillance footage of the suspect's vehicle.
That led detectives to a man named Jonathan Martinez.
He was identified as being the driver.
Then text messages and social media chatter led them to another man involved in the shooting.
That man was Assad Moody.
He was believed to be the shooter.
The facts of the crime are tragic.
Apparently, they were looking for a young man who had beaten up Moody.
They go out to get revenge,
Ultimately, it was a case of mistaken identity.
Moody had fired on a group of complete strangers.
And the aftermath was just as baffling.
Assad Moody took responsibility for his actions. He turned himself in, later pled guilty, but not Jonathan.
At the time that the warrant for his indictment was issued, he had apparently fled and was suspected to be in Mexico.
The guy was living in Juarez.
According to Yasmin's parents, he hadn't gone alone.
She actually was with him in Juarez, and she came back last week.
She was in Albuquerque for approximately 1 week before she went missing.
Based on the information from Yasmin's parents, the dispatcher escalates the call.
They decided it was an endangered missing girl.
We will go ahead and have a deputy come make contact with you.
Him being on the run and him having an active warrant for his arrest was a big concern.
When detectives arrive at their home, Yvonne says she had no idea that Jonathan was a wanted man when her daughter left.
She explained that Yasmin only found out about this shooting right before they went to Mexico.
He told her that he had a warrant, but that he wanted to give it some time because he was going to come back and clear it up because he was not involved.
Of course, he denies it all to her, and she follows them there because he's the love of her life, and they plan to get married.
She says that she loved him and that she wanted to be with him.
She says that she had only learned of the arrest warrant after the fact.
A family member sent over a video from the news saying that he had to appear in court. And I'm like, why? Is he hiding something?
Yvonne explains that she Googled Jonathan's name. That is how she found out about this arrest warrant.
Yasmin's mother just knew she was in danger over in Mexico, and she wanted her home.
I kept telling her, you need to come back.
Yasmin said no, she needed to be by his side. She didn't believe the allegations against him.
I even tried sending a family member over to get her, but she would not. Just didn't want out. So, the relationship.
But Yvonne tells detectives that recently, something changed.
I got a call from my daughter a few days later saying that she wanted to come back home.
She said she didn't feel safe there.
I told her, well, you don't even have to ask. Come back home as soon as possible. And she said, okay.
Yvonne sent Yasmin money for a bus ticket, and just like that, she was back home.
But now, Yasmin has disappeared.
Yvonne is worried that she has run off to be with Jonathan again. Detectives asked Yvonne, do you think Yasmin went back to Mexico? And she explains no.
Because before detectives arrived, she'd spoken to Yasmin's best friend.
This friend told Yvonne that Yasmin said Jonathan was now back in town.
Supposedly, he was coming back to turn himself in.
The mother of missing 20-year-old Yasmin Marquez has just told detectives that she thinks her daughter might have left to meet up with her fugitive boyfriend, Jonathan Martinez.
Allegedly, he'd been hiding out in Mexico because of his involvement in a drive-by shooting that left one teenager dead and another injured.
But if Yasmin is with Jonathan, it appears she went willingly.
Police, of course, want to know, Yvonne, did you hear anything that morning?
Yvonne explains that she didn't hear any type of altercation in the middle of the night. There was no signs of struggle in her room. Everything is in place, no disturbance.
So everyone concludes that Yasmin left on her own volition. No one forced her out of that house.
One thing is certain, though. If Jonathan had told Yasmin that he was going to turn himself in, he hasn't done it yet.
There's no records of him contacting police, the DA's office, the sheriff's office, the fugitive squad, the marshal's office.
Detectives wonder if maybe Yasmin had a change of heart.
Maybe Yasmin decided that I want to be with Jonathan. He came back to get her, and they left for Mexico, and that's where they are.
As detectives are finishing up with Yasmin's parents, her best friend, Ketsia Loya, arrives at the house.
What are you worried about?
Her friend expressed immediate concern to law enforcement.
We used to talk often until she started dating him. She got really distant.
Jonathan was very controlling, didn't allow her to put makeup on. He was very jealous.
When she was on the phone, she would have to have it on speaker so he could hear every word of every conversation.
According to Ketsia, Yasmin was essentially held in Juarez against her will.
He was locking her up in the house, and that's the reason why she couldn't text me, because she didn't have Wi-Fi. She went to the bathroom, he would go after her. She wouldn't do anything alone.
He spent every moment of his life watching over her.
There were verbal threats, emotional threats, perhaps even physical threats.
She was notices beating on me.
Ketsia alleges the violence escalated to the point Yasmin had to draw the line.
The reason she ultimately made that decision to come back to the United States was that Jonathan Martinez had pointed a gun at her head.
That's when Yasmin knew she had to get out of there.
She didn't feel safe with him anymore.
Exactly how Yasmin escaped is unclear, but it happened in a hurry.
She realized that she would be in danger if she continued to stay there.
And now it appears that Jonathan has followed Yasmin back to Albuquerque.
Ketsia explains that Yasmin had texted her to tell her Jonathan was back in town.
Supposedly, his friend had driven him back to New Mexico.
The evidence certainly seems to indicate that he came back from Mexico to confront her.
Yasmin was afraid that Jonathan would beat her for leaving him.
I know that she believes that he's capable of hurting her.
Despite that, her friend fears Yasmin met with him anyway.
She is worried that Yasmin may have suffered more than a beating.
That's because around 1:30 a.m., Yasmin sent her a chilling text message.
It said, "I'm gonna get killed, bro." And it was followed by a skull emoji.
Ketsia Loya, best friend of Yasmin Marquez, has just shown detectives an ominous text message that the missing woman sent her shortly before she disappeared.
She says that I'm gonna get killed?
Mm-hmm. This certainly suggests that Yasmin could be in danger.
After talking to Yasmin's parents and best friend, detectives head back to the station.
Once the sheriff's department knew of her association with Jonathan Martinez, there were efforts made right away to get her entered into NCIC nationwide as a missing and endangered person.
We were able to push out a bolo, be on the lookout for her vehicle.
There were immediate emergency search warrants that were served to get her phone records in an attempt to identify who she was communicating with and also geolocations.
Then detectives attempt to contact Jonathan and the friend that allegedly brought him back from Mexico.
They went to each of their last known addresses, but they never located the two.
But it's the bolo on Yasmin's vehicle that gives detectives their first indication of what's happened to her.
We were contacted by the Corrales Police Department, which is to the north of Albuquerque.
The vehicle was parked on the back country road, all dirt, There's very few houses in that area.
They located the vehicle partially burned.
Detectives have the car towed to conduct their search.
Apparently, someone set the car on fire, but they closed the doors and the windows, and the flames sputtered out,
which left a substantial amount of evidence behind.
First of all, they found a canister of lighter fluid.
That's possibly used as an accelerant to start the vehicle on fire.
They found a phone case that had Yasmin's driver's license and also her social security card, but there was no phone.
They also find burnt clothing. Some of the clothing appears to have blood on it.
Other things were a Sprite bottle and some rings that were believed to belong to Jonathan Martinez.
Have a seat.
After the search of Yasmin's car, detectives circle back to her best friend, Ketsia.
She had access to Yasmin's Snapchat account, and she pulled up some pictures of the ring that Yasmin wore and showed them, saying, look, she's wearing it right here.
That's the ring that Jonathan gave her?
Yeah.
Yasmin was still wearing this ring when she came back from Mexico.
I had asked her like why she hadn't taken it off, and she said that it's just gonna take time because she was still hurting from everything. I was like, well, just take off the ring, like it's not worth it. You're just gonna like keep thinking about it.
I couldn't imagine what she felt like to watch somebody who you love be abused. All she could do was try to be there and protect her and be her advocate.
Jonathan is a strong suspect, but he's not the only man detectives have questions about.
When I started to dive into the phone records of Yasmin, we look at some of the last people that she spoke to that day. And one of them was another kid named Brian. That was one of the last ones. And then it was Jonathan.
You know Brian?
Brian Ramirez? Yeah. She was like really good friends with him.
What do you mean good friends?
Ketsia tells detectives that Yasmin had recently reconnected with Brian.
He had asked her out to eat, I believe, like a couple days after she was here.
Was it possible this guy wanted more from Yasmin than she could give and got jealous?
Detectives follow up on the lead and invite Yasmin's other romantic interest in for an interview.
He predominantly spoke Spanish.
He confirms that he has known Yasmin since high school, but he lost touch with her after graduation. He explains that in early April, they connected again and they had hung out a few times.
After Yasmin got back from Mexico, they started hooking up.
He also explains that they hooked up the night that Yasmin disappeared.
He claims that Yasmin had picked him up at his house around 11:30 that Thursday night.
They went to the hotel parking lot, hung out in the car as friends with benefits. After that, they hung out enjoying one another's company.
He tells police that as they sat in the car, Yasmin had told him she was afraid of Jonathan.
He says that Yasmin told him that Jonathan was dangerous, that he was abusive.
She said she'd only escaped him in Juarez because she had managed to lock Jonathan in a room.
She was scared. She thought she was going to get hurt.
Brian Ramirez, the new man in Yasmin Marquez's life, has just told police that on the night she disappeared, she told him she feared her boyfriend Jonathan was going to kill her.
He tells police that while he and Yasmin were hanging out, her phone was blowing up. And it was Jonathan.
Like, please.
Why won't you answer?
I love him. But I'm scared of him.
He told police that Yasmin eventually picked up the phone.
He could hear something to the effect that I'm coming, you better not be with anybody else.
He says shortly after they hung up, Yasmin took him home.
He asked her point blank, "Are you going to see Jonathan tonight?" Yasmin said, "No, no way." But he didn't think she was being honest about that.
And he hasn't heard from her since.
He said that he texted Yasmin the next morning. The messages was read, but there was no reply.
But is he telling the truth?
At this point, detectives confiscate his phone and they take swabs for DNA.
But while detectives are still wondering if they have a new suspect, they learn that police have just picked up Jonathan on his prior arrest warrant for the drive-by shooting.
Law enforcement knew he was back in the area. They were able to locate him. He was in a vehicle with a prior girlfriend of his at the time. Officers and deputies move in and make their arrest.
Arresting officers find him in possession of 2 phones.
One of those phones belongs to Yasmin.
When the detective sits down with Jonathan, he does his best to get some answers.
We had him transported to be interviewed, and I interviewed him.
Maybe there's a reason why something happened. I could tell everybody, not everything's black and white.
He tried to provide this narrative, oh, anything could have happened. But Jonathan wasn't biting at all.
I'm not gonna answer no questions. There's, like, you know what I'm saying, I don't have a lawyer here.
Basically, he just lawyers up. But the lead detective pushes a little more.
So I think somebody that would have loved her would help us out, try to figure out where she's at.
Yeah, your guess is just as good as mine, you know what I'm saying? Like, I've just been trying to lay low because I have a warrant.
Jonathan denies meeting up with Yasmin. He says, "I don't know where she is."
I'm telling you right now, we didn't go nowhere.
I tried different angles, but he wouldn't budge. He didn't really have anything to say to us.
So I don't know where she's at. That's what I'm telling you.
So the detective concludes the interview.
As they prepare to wrap up this so-called interview, they have a parting shot for Jonathan.
Wherever she's at, I mean, hopefully we find her good and healthy. Because it seems like the people that she loved don't really care about her.
This triggers Jonathan.
And when he's left alone in the room, he makes a telling statement.
If she is still alive, shouldn't it be "I love her," not "I loved her"?
With Jonathan stonewalling them, detectives go another route for information.
I obtained a search warrant for his phone, and we did what's called a phone extraction, and then we can see everything.
The data they recover tells them everything they need to know.
Their cell phone records showed us a path of travel when she went missing.
He was with Yasmin in this area, and we see their cell phones heading out to the Pajarito Mesa. And then Yasmin's phone went off.
After that, Jonathan's phone heads back to Albuquerque, stopping at a gas station along the way.
He then continued to travel for upwards of 25 to 30 miles north to a nearby town called Bernalillo.
But that isn't the end of his journey.
He stops north in the Jemez Mountains and stays there for a while, then heads back south to Albuquerque.
Detectives suspect that a search of the area could lead them to Yasmin.
Initially, all the data that we had from the phones were putting them out on the Pajarito Mesa. So we exhausted canines, helicopters, and we took 50 deputies and detectives, and we just walked in a straight line around the points looking for anything we could find. But we found nothing.
Detectives grow increasingly frustrated.
We just couldn't stop until we could find her. So we work with the Albuquerque Police Department's digital forensic team. They do incredible work for us.
Detective Carol and Detective Marina Lorena reached out and asked for help, and so I started helping.
And soon, they make a breakthrough.
Most of the people we encounter haven't really pre-planned a lot of things. So they're not pre-planning, I need to turn off my phone. So there's just always little breadcrumbs that we're hoping to find and kind of piece together.
She's like, I think I know where she's at. And I said, oh my gosh, are you serious? And she's like, yeah. She says they were using a tower in Jemez. And she did some math and was like, I think it's probably around mile marker 9 on 550.
Detectives get just past a turnout at mile marker number 9 and come to a stop.
As soon as I exited my vehicle, I could smell rotting flesh.
It smells like something's dead. Can you smell that? Yeah.
And behind a bush not far off that road, they find a pile of roofing shingles.
I lifted up some of the shingles.
There's hair. It's a body. There's hair.
Following data from Jonathan Martinez's cell phone, detectives have found human remains in a remote desert location outside Albuquerque.
I was in my office. I will probably never forget this moment. Detective Carroll called me and he said, hey, we found her. I can't even describe the feeling of like how good that felt, because I don't know if you ever really get a sense of justice, right? Because you never get your person back. But at least you know where she is now. It's just being able to give that closure.
It was very bittersweet. We were glad that our efforts had finally found her, but obviously not in the way that the family would like to, right?
It leads to a conversation that no detective ever wants to have.
They just let us know that they had found remains of a young woman. They believed it was Yasmin, but they were not sure yet until they did DNA and all that.
Mom gave me some information about her dental visits, and I supplied that to the Office of the Medical Investigator.
They were able to use dental records to then positively identify the remains.
It was just a big shock because I feel like as a mother, you always know if something's wrong. And I always knew that something was not right. But I guess I didn't want to lose hope.
While it was clear the remains belonged to Yasmin, her cause of death was less certain.
There were no obvious injuries to the body that remained. It appeared most likely that some kind of suffocation or asphyxiation would account for the lack of other injuries that were observed.
We're finally then felt, okay, now we can hold him accountable for the things that he did.
With Jonathan already in custody, prosecutors charge him with murder, while detectives compile their evidence against him.
They tracked down any surveillance footage they could find along that fateful route revealed through the phone data.
Surveillance video was crucial in this case. There was video of someone who fit his description going to a gas station, coming out with one bottle of Sprite.
We were able to see Jonathan in her car. Now, in that car, we don't see Yasmin up front. We don't see her in the back seat.
The detectives were also able to then go to the Walmart up in Bernalillo, where the phones had suggested that Jonathan Martinez was, and then is seen on video purchasing a single item, being a bottle of lighter fluid.
It's very clear that Jonathan was our guy.
In August of 2024, Jonathan first stands trial for the 2021 murder of Trevante Robbins in the drive-by shooting.
Assad Moody, the shooter in the drive-by, pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, but he did not testify against Jonathan.
And without Assad's testimony, the prosecutors are unable to secure a conviction.
It was a hung jury. They were unable to return a unanimous verdict.
A lot is riding on the outcome when Jonathan stands trial for Yasmin's murder in October 2024.
Our strategy was to present as much of that digital evidence to really narrow down on that there was nobody else that could have been responsible for this homicide other than Jonathan Martinez.
Prosecutors used the evidence to lay out their theory of what happened that night.
There are communications that says, do I need to be worried that you're going to beat me up? So there was obviously concerns and kind of implied threats from him. And when they met in the park and then drove off, probably there was an argument that started.
Why did you leave me like that?
Because I've got better things to do than hide out in Mexico.
She had been sexually involved earlier in the day. It may have been something like that that then finally triggered what happened.
How many times do I have to tell you I'll kill you? Wait, before you get it through your head.
You're hurting me, Jonathan.
He killed her and then dumped her body out into the desert.
He then took her car, drove it out to Corrales, and lit it partially on fire. I think he thought that the car would explode and get rid of the evidence, but it didn't.
It was circumstantial, but with the digital evidence, as well as a Sprite bottle that was recovered, and DNA testing did identify Jonathan Martinez's DNA on that Sprite bottle. It seemed to be a pretty strong connection.
Taking the stand in his defense, Jonathan does admit to meeting Yasmin that night.
He admitted that he had met up with her at the park and that they had left the park together in her car. He stated that she dropped him off at a friend's house and that that was the last he saw of her.
Which might have been enough, if not for the mountain of evidence prosecutors had.
He couldn't explain him driving Yasmin's car. He couldn't explain him buying the lighter fluid. He couldn't explain a lot.
It was very obvious he was lying.
They find him guilty of first-degree murder.
The judge sentenced Jonathan to life in prison, and that means he has to serve 30 years before he is eligible for parole.
It's a relief that Jonathan will finally be held accountable for his actions.
I was in shock. I was feeling so many emotions. I just dropped to the ground, and I thanked God.
But I think there's never really justice because Yasmin's family is always going to have one less person at the table.
It's been very hard for our family. Everybody is really affected by it. It's not the same without her.
Florence is a city the world associates with beauty. It is a place where Renaissance masterpieces hang beneath vaulted ceilings, where narrow stone streets echo with the footsteps of travelers, and where centuries of history seem preserved in every weathered wall. Every morning, before the crowds gather around Piazza del Duomo, the historic center belongs to delivery workers, priests making their way toward morning duties, shopkeepers lifting heavy shutters, and residents beginning another ordinary day. It is a city that appears timeless, almost untouched by the kinds of violence that dominate headlines elsewhere. Yet even cities celebrated for art and faith have shadows. Sometimes those shadows fall in places where no one expects them. On the morning of March 24th, 1995, one of those shadows settled inside a small religious bookstore hidden within the Archdiocesan Curia on Via del Proconsolo. What happened there lasted no more than 15 minutes. More than 3 decades later, those 15 minutes remain among the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in modern Italian criminal history. The victim was not a politician, a businessman, or someone known to live a dangerous life. He was a 65-year-old retired printer named Gianfranco Cacchini. He had spent decades working with paper, ink, and carefully crafted typography before retiring in 1990. Retirement, however, did not mean withdrawing from daily life. Instead, he accepted part-time work at the Manueli bookstore, a quiet establishment specializing in religious books and devotional objects. Those who visited the shop were typically priests, nuns, parish workers, and ordinary believers looking for Bibles, rosaries, statues, prayer books, or communion wafers. It was the kind of workplace where conversations were often conducted in hushed voices and where customers usually knew one another by name. Violence simply did not belong there. That Friday morning was never supposed to be Gianfranco's shift. The change happened because the owner needed to accompany his daughter to an eye appointment and asked Gianfranco to take his place. It seemed like an ordinary favor between colleagues. The sort of small adjustment that happens in workplaces every day without anyone giving it a second thought. Gianfranco agreed. He arrived early, opened the bookstore, and began preparing for another peaceful morning among shelves filled with religious texts and sacred objects. Looking back, investigators would later become deeply interested in that seemingly insignificant schedule change. They would ask a question that still has no answer today. If Gianfranco was never meant to be there that morning, how did the killer find him? Around 8:30 a.m., someone saw Gianfranco alive. According to witness testimony, he was entering the bookstore accompanied by another individual described only as having long hair. The witness could not determine whether this person was a man or a woman. Distance and the brief nature of the encounter made identification impossible. At the time, there was nothing unusual about what had been seen. Customers entered bookstores every day. People walked together through Florence's historic streets constantly. No one imagined that this fleeting observation would later become one of the most important and frustrating clues in a murder investigation. It was the last confirmed sighting of Gianfranco Cacchini alive. Approximately 15 minutes later, another routine event unfolded. Father Sergio Bafasai approached the bookstore intending to collect communion wafers. It was a familiar errand, one that had undoubtedly been performed many times before. He knocked on the rear entrance, expecting Gianfranco to answer. Silence. He knocked again. Still nothing. There was no immediate reason to panic. Perhaps Gianfranco had stepped into another room. Perhaps he was organizing stock or retrieving merchandise. After waiting and receiving no response, Father Bafasai walked through the courtyard to reach another entrance. The moment he stepped inside, the ordinary morning ended. Behind a counter lay Gianfranco Cacchini. He was motionless, surrounded by blood. The peaceful bookstore had become a homicide scene. Emergency services and police were summoned, but there was nothing anyone could do for the victim. The attack had already ended, and whoever was responsible had disappeared. Investigators would eventually determine that Gianfranco had suffered 27 stab wounds. The sheer number immediately suggested extraordinary violence. Yet the surrounding environment seemed strangely inconsistent with such brutality. Shelves remained standing. Merchandise had not been scattered across the floor. There were no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle. Cash remained untouched. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The contrast between the ferocity of the attack and the calm appearance of the shop would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. It was as though an explosion of violence had erupted within a carefully preserved moment, leaving behind death but very little disorder. The forensic examination raised even more questions. Despite 27 stab wounds, Gianfranco showed virtually no defensive injuries on his arms. That detail suggested he had not fought back in any meaningful way. Investigators believed he was likely attacked suddenly, perhaps from behind, before he had any opportunity to react. If that reconstruction was correct, the first blow may have incapacitated him almost immediately. Yet the attack did not stop there. The assailant continued stabbing again and again. Why? Was it rage? Determination? Panic? The evidence could not answer those questions. It could only document what had happened physically, not why it had happened. Even the murder weapon seemed determined to remain a mystery. Experts believed it may have been a large pair of scissors, a paper knife, or another similar single-edged blade. No weapon was ever recovered. Without it, investigators lost one of the most valuable sources of forensic evidence available in any homicide. There were no usable fingerprints that could identify the attacker. There were no clear shoe impressions leading investigators toward a suspect. The forensic capabilities available in 1995 also failed to recover usable DNA from the unknown killer. Every missing piece widened the gap between investigators and the truth. One small detail, nevertheless, captured the attention of crime scene analysts. A single drop of blood on a wooden chair positioned near the body. According to the reconstruction proposed by investigators, Gianfranco may have been bending down, possibly to retrieve a set of keys when the first attack occurred, as the weapon was withdrawn after the initial strike. Blood, dripping from its blade, may have fallen onto the chair. It was a tiny detail in a room filled with tragedy. Yet tiny details often become the foundation of homicide investigations. Unfortunately, this one did not reveal the identity of the person who had held the weapon. The layout of the building presented another important clue. Investigators determined that the rear door had been locked from inside. Father Bafasai had repeatedly knocked there without receiving an answer. This suggested that the killer almost certainly left through the bookstore's front entrance only, minutes before the body was discovered. If that conclusion was correct, the murderer had walked directly onto Via del Proconsolo, blending almost effortlessly into the ordinary flow of pedestrians in Florence's historic center. Someone leaving a bookstore on a Friday morning would hardly attract attention. The killer may have disappeared into the city in plain sight. Then there was the mysterious long-haired individual. Investigators devoted considerable attention to locating this person because they represented the final known individual seen entering the bookstore alongside Gianfranco. Despite interviews, appeals, and repeated investigative efforts, the identity of that person has never been established. Whether the individual was a customer, an acquaintance, an innocent visitor, or the killer remains unknown. Their absence from the historical record transformed a simple eyewitness observation into one of the most haunting unanswered questions in the entire investigation. Another unusual lead briefly drew police attention. Witnesses reported seeing a woman walking near the bookstore while holding an umbrella. Blood was later found on the umbrella, immediately raising suspicion. Investigators examined the evidence carefully, but testing showed the blood did not belong to Gianfranco Cacchini. The woman also established a credible alibi. She was eliminated from the investigation, leaving detectives once again without a viable suspect. Inside the bookstore, investigators also found a notebook containing 3 enigmatic words. Umarum. The phrase appeared meaningless, yet enough uncertainty surrounded it that specialists in language, religion, and cryptography were consulted in an effort to determine whether it carried hidden significance. Various theories emerged over the years, including possible references to the Hindu goddess Uma or to religious terminology, while others argued it might be entirely unrelated to the murder. None of these interpretations could be proven. The phrase remains another unresolved fragment in a case already overflowing with unanswered questions. As investigators continued their work, several theories emerged. Robbery was quickly dismissed because money and merchandise remained untouched. A random attack seemed difficult to reconcile with the apparent knowledge that Gianfranco would be working alone on a day that had not originally been his shift. This led many investigators toward the possibility that the killer knew the victim, or at least knew his unexpected schedule. Another theory considered whether someone with extremist or unusual religious beliefs might have been involved, especially because Gianfranco had reportedly mentioned to his wife that certain visitors to the bookstore made him uncomfortable and that he suspected some individuals could be connected with unusual rituals or so-called black masses. Yet despite considerable attention, investigators never found evidence capable of supporting that possibility. Every theory eventually collided with the same obstacle. There simply was not enough evidence to transform suspicion into proof. There would be no arrest. There would be no courtroom testimony. There would be no confession. The years passed. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and technology advanced. Yet the identity of the killer remained hidden. Today, the murder of Gianfranco Cacchini continues to stand among Florence's most enduring cold cases. It is remembered not because of celebrity or political scandal, but because of its extraordinary contradictions: a peaceful bookstore, a retired craftsman, a routine favor, an attack of astonishing brutality, a killer who vanished within minutes, and a handful of clues that have never come together to reveal the truth. The mystery begins with those 15 minutes on a quiet Friday morning. But even after more than 30 years, no one has been able to explain exactly what happened inside that little bookstore or why Gianfranco Cacchini never walked back out. Long before his name appeared in police files or newspaper headlines, Gianfranco Cacchini lived a life defined not by conflict, but by routine. There was nothing about his background that suggested he would one day become the victim of one of Florence's most enduring unsolved murders. He was not involved in organized crime, political activism, or public controversy. He did not hold a position of influence, nor was he known to have enemies. To those around him, he was simply a hard-working man who had spent decades mastering a traditional craft before embracing a quieter life after retirement. That ordinary existence is precisely what continues to make his death so unsettling. In many notorious homicide cases, investigators begin with an obvious source of tension: financial disputes, family conflicts, criminal associations, or public feuds. In Gianfranco Cacchini's case, there appeared to be none of those things. The violence that ended his life seemed to emerge from nowhere, directed at a man whose daily routine revolved around books, faith, and service rather than confrontation. Gianfranco was born around 1930, a period during which Italy, like much of Europe, was entering years of enormous political and social upheaval. Over the course of his lifetime, he witnessed a nation transformed by war, reconstruction, economic growth, and cultural change. Yet the available records of his personal life reveal little interest in public attention. Instead, his career reflected patience, discipline, and precision. He worked for many years as an art printer and typographer, a profession demanding accuracy rather than speed. Typography is an occupation where mistakes are measured in millimeters, where attention to detail determines the quality of every finished page. Long before digital publishing became commonplace, printers handled metal type, paper, ink, and complex machinery with extraordinary care. Every page represented hours of preparation. Every printed line required concentration. It was meticulous work, often unnoticed by those who eventually held the finished books in their hands. John Franco devoted much of his professional life to that quiet craft. Those who spend decades working in printing often develop habits that remain with them forever. Organization becomes instinctive. Precision becomes second nature. Even after retirement, such individuals rarely become comfortable with idleness. In 1990, John Franco officially retired from his career. For many people, retirement marks the beginning of slower mornings, family gatherings, hobbies, and the gradual transition away from professional responsibilities. But retirement did not mean complete withdrawal from daily life for John Franco. Rather than spending every day at home, he accepted part-time employment at the Manueli bookstore in Florence. The decision appears practical and unremarkable. Many retirees seek opportunities to remain active, continue contributing to their communities, and maintain familiar routines. Working a few days each week offered structure without the demands of full-time employment. It also placed John Franco in an environment that suited his personality. Books had always been closely connected to his previous profession. As a printer, he had helped produce printed materials. As a bookseller, he helped place them into the hands of readers. The transition carried a certain quiet symmetry. The Manueli bookstore occupied a distinctive location inside the Curia Arcivescovile, the administrative center of the Archdiocese of Florence on Via del Proconsolo. This was not an ordinary commercial district filled with noisy markets or crowded department stores. The surroundings reflected centuries of religious tradition. Clergy moved through the area as part of their daily duties. Visitors arrived seeking religious guidance as often as they came to purchase books. The atmosphere encouraged calm conversation rather than hurried transactions. Shelves held Bibles, theological works, devotional texts, rosaries, religious statues, prayer cards, and numerous objects intended for liturgical use. Communion wafers and other materials necessary for church services were also supplied through the bookstore. The clientele reflected that specialized mission. Priests preparing for Mass, nuns purchasing devotional materials, parish employees organizing religious activities, and ordinary believers searching for spiritual literature all passed through its doors. Unlike businesses serving thousands of anonymous customers each week, this bookstore often welcomed familiar faces. Many customers likely returned regularly. Relationships developed naturally through repeated encounters, shared conversations, and common religious interests. It was an environment built upon trust. Nothing in its daily operation suggested danger. The surrounding neighborhood reinforced that sense of security. Via del Proconsolo lies within Florence's historic center, only a short walk from the city's magnificent cathedral. Every stone street bears witness to centuries of history. Renaissance architecture surrounds pedestrians from every direction. During daylight hours, residents, workers, clergy, and visitors move steadily through the area. Even today, it remains one of the city's most recognizable locations. In 1995, the district carried the same reputation for stability and cultural importance. Violent crime was not what people expected to encounter there. This context would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Murders can occur anywhere, but there are certain places where violence feels especially out of place. A religious bookstore inside a church administrative complex ranks among them. Investigators therefore faced not only the question of who committed the crime, but also why such an apparently secure environment became the setting for such extraordinary brutality. John Franco himself appeared well suited to this peaceful workplace. There is no evidence within the available information suggesting that he sought conflict or lived an unpredictable lifestyle. Instead, his daily responsibilities were straightforward. He opened a shop, organized merchandise, assisted customers, and ensured religious materials remained available for those who needed them. The work required courtesy, patience, and reliability rather than physical strength or personal risk. His age also deserves consideration. At 65 years old, Gianfranco had entered a stage of life when many individuals become increasingly attached to routine. Familiar schedules provide comfort. Unexpected changes become less common. Yet, ironically, it was precisely one unexpected change that placed him inside the bookstore on the morning of March 24th, 1995. According to the known facts, that Friday was never intended to be his working day. The bookstore owner faced a personal obligation, taking his daughter to an eye appointment. Unable to open the shop personally, he asked Gianfranco to substitute. Gianfranco agreed. Nothing about the request appears unusual. Small businesses frequently depend upon mutual cooperation. Employees cover shifts for one another. Retirees working part-time often provide flexibility exactly for situations like these. At the time, neither man could possibly have imagined that this simple adjustment would become one of the central mysteries of a homicide investigation. Investigators would later examine this schedule change with extraordinary attention because of its remarkable implications. If Gianfranco had not originally been expected to work, then the killer's timing becomes deeply significant. Was the murder planned specifically for that morning? If so, how did the attacker know Gianfranco would be present instead of the owner? Was the schedule observed by someone familiar with the bookstore's daily routine? Or was the timing nothing more than coincidence? These questions remain unanswered because the available evidence provides no definitive explanation. Nevertheless, the timing transformed an ordinary act of workplace cooperation into one of the investigation's most puzzling circumstances. It also encouraged detectives to consider whether the murderer possessed prior knowledge unavailable to ordinary members of the public. Such knowledge would imply familiarity either with the victim, the business, or someone connected to its operations. Yet suspicion alone could never replace evidence. No witness came forward to explain how such information might have become known beyond his professional life. Only limited public information exists regarding Gianfranco's private world. He lived in Sesto Fiorentino, just outside Florence, with his family. He was married and had 2 children. These details, though brief, emphasize the ordinary structure of his life. He was a husband, a father, a retiree continuing part-time work, and a man whose responsibilities centered upon family and community rather than public recognition. When investigators attempted to identify motives, they naturally examined those closest to him. Yet no widely documented personal conflict emerged capable of explaining the extraordinary violence inflicted upon him. Friends and relatives reportedly knew of no serious disputes that might have escalated into murder. That absence of an obvious personal motive forced investigators to widen their search. But every new possibility introduced additional uncertainty rather than clarity. There is one detail that would later receive attention during the investigation. Before his death, Gianfranco reportedly told his wife that certain visitors to the bookstore made him uncomfortable. According to the available information, he believed some individuals might have been associated with unusual religious practices or so-called black masses. This statement naturally attracted investigative interest because the bookstore specialized in religious materials and occupied a location closely connected with the Catholic Church. However, it is essential to distinguish between concern and evidence. Gianfranco's reported observations reflected his personal impressions rather than verified facts. Detectives considered the possibility carefully, but despite examining the idea, they never discovered evidence capable of confirming that such visitors had any connection to the murder. The theory, therefore, remained only one possibility among many, never progressing into an established conclusion. This distinction is important because unsolved cases often accumulate speculation over time. In the absence of definitive answers, unusual details tend to assume greater significance than the available evidence can actually support. Responsible investigation requires separating intriguing possibilities from demonstrable facts. In John Franco's case, investigators consistently encountered the same problem. Every potentially meaningful clue eventually reached a point beyond which it could no longer be verified. Looking back from the perspective of more than 30 years later, perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Gianfranco Cacchini's story is its complete ordinariness before the morning of March 24th, 1995. Nothing in the documented record suggests he anticipated danger when he accepted the substitute shift. Nothing indicates he expected that opening the bookstore would become his final act. Like countless workers beginning their day, he likely approached the morning with the expectation that routine would continue exactly as it always had. Shelves would be arranged, customers would arrive, conversations would be exchanged, the business would close at the end of the day, and life would continue. Instead, that ordinary morning became the final chapter of a life that had largely unfolded in quiet anonymity. The contrast between the peaceful world Gianfranco inhabited and the violence that interrupted it remains one of the defining features of this case. It is not merely the mystery of an unidentified killer that continues to trouble investigators. It is the fact that the victim himself appears so completely disconnected from the level of brutality inflicted upon him. A retired printer working part-time in a religious bookstore was attacked with astonishing violence inside one of Florence's most tranquil settings. Understanding who Gianfranco was does not solve the mystery of who killed him, but it explains why the case continues to resonate decades later. Before investigators can ask why someone committed such a crime, they must first understand the life that was taken. Only then does the full weight of those missing 15 minutes begin to emerge, transforming an unsolved homicide into a deeply human story about an ordinary man whose quiet routine ended in extraordinary tragedy. By every outward measure, the morning of Friday, March 24th, 1995, began like countless other mornings in Florence. The city was awakening with the familiar rhythm that had repeated itself for generations. Shopkeepers prepared their businesses for the day ahead. Clergy moved between churches and offices within the historic center. Residents crossed the ancient streets on their way to work, while visitors admired buildings that had stood for centuries. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested that, within one of the quietest corners of the city, an act of extraordinary violence was only minutes away. For Gianfranco Cacchini, the day represented nothing more than a small favor. He was covering a shift that had originally belonged to someone else. There was no indication that he approached the bookstore with any sense of danger or concern. His routine was familiar. Open the shop, prepare for customers, arrange the merchandise if necessary, wait for the steady flow of priests, nuns, parish workers, and faithful visitors who regularly entered the Manueli bookstore in search of religious books and devotional items. Instead, that ordinary routine would come to an abrupt and irreversible end within an astonishingly short period of time, according to the reconstruction established by investigators. Gianfranco arrived at the bookstore at approximately 8:20 that morning. He unlocked the entrance and began preparing the premises for business. Like many small independent shops, the opening procedures were simple but methodical. Lights would be turned on, the counter would be prepared, merchandise would be checked. The bookstore, located within the Curia Arcivescovile on Via del Proconsolo, had every appearance of another peaceful working day. At that moment, there was no indication that anyone nearby was about to become the victim of a homicide. Yet one detail would later become central to the investigation. John Franco was not expected to be there according to the original work schedule. Only the previous change in plans, the owner's need to accompany his daughter to an eye appointment, had placed him behind that counter. Investigators would later return to this fact repeatedly because it transformed what appeared to be an ordinary murder into something potentially more calculated. If the attack had been planned, someone either knew about the schedule change or happened to arrive during an extraordinarily unlikely coincidence. The available evidence could never determine which explanation was correct. Around 8:30 a.m., the final confirmed sighting of John Franco Kakini occurred. A witness reported seeing him entering the bookstore accompanied by another individual described only as having long hair. The observation was brief. The witness could not determine whether the person was male or female. No detailed physical description could be provided beyond that single characteristic. At the time, there was nothing alarming about what had been seen. Customers entered the bookstore regularly. People often walked together through Florence's streets. The moment passed without attracting attention. Only later would investigators realize that this unidentified individual might represent the final person known to have entered the bookstore alongside John Franco before his death. Because no one recognized the importance of the encounter as it happened, valuable opportunities to observe additional details were lost forever. The person's clothing, age, facial features, mannerisms, or direction of travel afterward were never reliably documented. The witness had no reason to study someone who appeared to be engaged in an entirely ordinary activity. This is one of the cruel realities of many criminal investigations. The moments that later become critically important often appear completely insignificant while they are unfolding. If anyone else passed the bookstore during those next several minutes, nothing unusual appears to have caught their attention. There were no reports of screams echoing into the street. No accounts described frantic attempts to escape. No witnesses reported seeing obvious signs of violence through the windows. Whatever happened inside the bookstore unfolded with remarkable speed and apparent efficiency. This absence of external disturbance would later become one of the investigation's most perplexing features. The estimated window during which the attack occurred lasted only about 15 minutes. Within that brief period, John Franco Kakini was attacked, suffered 27 stab wounds, died behind the counter of the bookstore, and the killer disappeared without being identified. Even experienced investigators recognized how unusually compressed that timeline was. 15 minutes is barely enough time to complete an ordinary conversation. Yet within those same minutes, a homicide of exceptional brutality had taken place. The forensic examination suggested that John Franco was likely taken by surprise. One of the most important observations made during the autopsy concerned the absence of significant defensive injuries on his arms. In many knife attacks, victims instinctively raise their hands and forearms in an attempt to shield themselves. Such actions often leave characteristic cuts and wounds on the limbs. John Franco's body showed virtually none of those signs. Investigators therefore considered it highly likely that the initial attack came from behind or from a position that prevented him from reacting. The reconstruction proposed by investigators centered on another small but significant piece of evidence found at the scene. A single drop of blood resting on a wooden chair positioned near the victim. According to their theory, John Franco may have been bending down, possibly reaching for a set of keys when the attack began. If he was indeed leaning forward, his attention would have been directed away from anyone standing behind him. A powerful first stab could have incapacitated him immediately, eliminating any realistic opportunity for self-defense. As the attacker withdrew the blade after the initial strike, a drop of blood may have fallen from the weapon onto the nearby chair, leaving behind one of the few physical clues available to investigators. While this reconstruction cannot be proven with complete certainty, it is consistent with the physical evidence documented at the crime scene. After the initial blow, the assault continued with astonishing ferocity. John Franco sustained 27 stab wounds distributed across multiple areas of his body, including the back, abdomen, head, and other regions. Several wounds penetrated deeply into vital organs. Medical experts concluded that many of these injuries were inflicted after John Franco had already lost the ability to resist. This observation suggests that the attacker did not stop once the victim was incapacitated. Instead, the assault continued with repeated blows delivered in rapid succession. Such an extreme level of violence naturally raised difficult questions. Did the number of wounds indicate intense personal anger? Did it reflect panic? Was the attacker attempting to ensure death beyond any possibility of survival? The forensic evidence could establish only what happened physically. It could not identify the emotional state or motive of the individual holding the weapon. Equally striking was the condition of the bookstore itself. Investigators entering the scene expected to find extensive evidence of struggle, particularly given the number of stab wounds inflicted. Instead, they encountered an environment that appeared surprisingly orderly. Shelves remained standing. Merchandise had not been scattered across the floor. Displayed items were largely undisturbed. The cash remained untouched. Nothing suggested that the victim and his attacker had engaged in a prolonged physical confrontation. Throughout the shop, this apparent contradiction became one of the defining mysteries of the crime scene. How could such extraordinary violence occur without producing comparable disorder? Investigators believe the answer lay in the speed of the attack. If John Franco had indeed been surprised by the first blow and immediately lost the ability to defend himself effectively, there may never have been an opportunity for a prolonged struggle. The violence occurred within a confined space behind the counter rather than spreading throughout the bookstore. This interpretation also supported the absence of defensive injuries and the overall preservation of the surrounding environment. The murder weapon itself remained another frustrating unknown. Based upon the characteristics of the wounds, forensic experts believe the instrument may have been a large pair of scissors, a paper knife, or another similar single-edged blade. Because John Franco had spent much of his professional life in printing, and because bookstores naturally contain cutting tools used for opening packages and handling materials, investigators could not immediately determine whether the weapon originated inside the premises or had been brought there by the attacker. Ultimately, this question remained unanswered because the weapon completely disappeared. It was never recovered despite the investigation. Without the murder weapon, investigators lost an important opportunity to recover fingerprints, trace materials, or other forensic evidence that might have identified the killer. The lack of physical evidence extended beyond the missing weapon. Crime scene investigators searched carefully for fingerprints capable of identifying an unknown individual. None of sufficient value were recovered. They looked for shoe impressions that might indicate how the killer moved through the bookstore. No clear impressions were available. They searched for biological evidence that could distinguish the attacker from the victim. Given the limitations of forensic science available in 1995, no usable DNA profile of the killer could be developed. Each missing piece of evidence compounded the investigation's difficulties. The crime scene seemed almost determined to reveal as little information as possible about the person responsible. At approximately 8:45 a.m., another routine event unfolded only moments after the attack had ended. Father Sergio Bafasai arrived at the bookstore to collect communion wafers. Like John Franco himself, Father Bafasai had no reason to expect anything unusual. His visit formed part of ordinary religious duties. He approached the rear entrance and knocked. No answer came. Assuming John Franco might be occupied elsewhere inside the premises, he knocked again. Silence continued. There was still little reason to suspect of violent crime. Small shops often require workers to step away from the entrance briefly. After waiting, Father Bafasai decided to walk through the courtyard to access another entrance. What he encountered instead became the beginning of one of Florence's longest unsolved investigations. Behind the counter lay Gianfranco Cacchini, motionless in a pool of blood. The peaceful religious bookstore had been transformed into a homicide scene. Emergency assistance was summoned immediately, but there was nothing left to save. The attack had already concluded, and whoever carried it out had vanished. One further detail would later prove especially significant. Investigators determined that the rear entrance through which Father Bafasai had first attempted to enter remained locked from the inside. This finding carried an important implication. If the rear door had remained secured while Father Bafasai repeatedly knocked, then the killer almost certainly escaped through the bookstore's front entrance. That exit opened directly onto Via del Proconsolo, one of Florence's historic streets. The murderer likely stepped outside only minutes before Father Bafasai discovered the body, blending into the normal movement of pedestrians beginning their day. Countless people may have passed nearby without realizing they had crossed paths with someone who had just committed a murder. The simplicity of that escape continues to trouble investigators. The killer appears to have relied not on elaborate planning or dramatic flight, but on anonymity. A person walking calmly away from a bookstore in the center of Florence would attract no particular attention. The city itself became an ally, providing crowds, routine, and countless opportunities to disappear. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, the events became almost painfully concise. Around 8:20, John Franco opened the bookstore. Around 8:30, he was seen entering with an unidentified, long-haired individual. Sometime within the following minutes, he was attacked with overwhelming violence. By approximately 8:45, Father Sergio Bafasai discovered his body. Everything that transformed an ordinary working morning into one of Italy's most enduring cold cases occurred within that narrow interval. The brevity of the timeline is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the incident. 15 minutes separated routine from tragedy, life from death, certainty from mystery. More than 30 years later, investigators still know with confidence how long those final moments lasted. What they have never discovered is what exactly happened inside that bookstore during those missing minutes, or who walked back out alive. The moment Gianfranco Cacchini's body was discovered behind the counter of the Manueli bookstore, the investigation began with a difficult contradiction. On one hand, detectives were confronted with a homicide of exceptional brutality. 27 stab wounds suggested an attack carried out with overwhelming force and determination. On the other hand, almost everything else about the scene appeared strangely restrained. There was no shattered furniture, no overturned shelves, no obvious trail of destruction that would normally accompany such violence. It was as if two entirely different stories occupied the same room. One story spoke of rage, while the other suggested calm efficiency. Reconciling those two realities became the investigators' first challenge, and in many ways, it remained their greatest challenge throughout the years that followed. As officers secured the bookstore and forensic specialists began documenting every detail, they quickly realized that the crime scene offered remarkably few obvious answers. The body remained behind the sales counter, exactly where Father Sergio Bafasai had discovered it. The surrounding merchandise had not been scattered. Religious books remained neatly arranged on shelves. Statues and devotional objects appeared undisturbed. Cash had not been removed from the register or counter. Nothing indicated that the killer had searched the premises after the attack. This immediately weakened the possibility that robbery had been the primary motive. In many commercial murders, investigators expect to find missing money, forced drawers, or evidence that valuables have been taken. Here, the opposite appeared true. The financial contents of the bookstore remained untouched despite the extraordinary violence inflicted upon the victim. Detectives therefore began examining the physical evidence in far greater detail, hoping the scene itself might reveal how the attack had unfolded. The autopsy confirmed that John Franco had suffered 27 stab wounds distributed across multiple parts of his body, including the back, abdomen, head, and other areas. Several wounds penetrated deeply, indicating considerable force. Yet perhaps the most significant forensic observation was not the number of wounds but the absence of meaningful defensive injuries. Normally, victims confronted by an armed attacker instinctively attempt to protect themselves. Hands, forearms, and wrists frequently display cuts sustained while blocking or grabbing the weapon. John Franco's body displayed almost none of these classic defensive patterns. This finding strongly suggested that he had been deprived of any realistic opportunity to react. Investigators therefore considered the possibility that the first strike occurred before he even realized danger was present. The theory of a surprise attack soon became central to the official reconstruction, supporting that reconstruction was one of the smallest yet most intriguing pieces of evidence found inside the bookstore. A single drop of blood resting on a wooden chair positioned near where the body was discovered. At first glance, the bloodstain seemed insignificant when compared to the extensive blood surrounding the victim. Yet experienced crime scene investigators understand that isolated stains often preserve valuable information about movement during violent events. Specialists proposed a sequence consistent with the available evidence. They believed John Franco may have been bending downward, possibly reaching for a set of keys, when the assailant approached from behind. In that position, his balance and attention would have been directed away from anyone standing behind him. The first stab may have landed with sufficient force to incapacitate him almost immediately. As the attacker withdrew the blade, a drop of blood could have fallen from the weapon onto the nearby chair before the assault continued. Although impossible to prove definitively, this reconstruction explained several otherwise puzzling details simultaneously. The absence of defensive wounds, the confined location of the struggle, and the isolated bloodstain on the chair. Unfortunately, the chair itself could not identify the killer. In 1995, forensic science had not yet reached the level of sophistication available decades later. The blood on the chair appeared to originate from the attack itself, but investigators could not extract additional information capable of revealing the identity of the person holding the weapon. Modern audiences often assume that every crime scene automatically produces DNA evidence leading directly to a suspect. The reality of forensic investigation during the mid-1990s was considerably different. Biological evidence could be extraordinarily valuable, but only when sufficient material survived under suitable conditions and could be analyzed using the technology available at the time. In John Franco's case, those conditions simply did not produce the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. The search for fingerprints proved equally disappointing. Crime scene technicians carefully examined surfaces throughout the bookstore, hoping that the killer had inadvertently touched a counter, shelf, display case, or door. Yet no usable fingerprints capable of identifying an unknown suspect were recovered. This absence did not necessarily indicate deliberate efforts by the killer to erase evidence. Public businesses naturally accumulate fingerprints from employees, customers, suppliers, and visitors every day. Distinguishing one unidentified print from countless legitimate contacts can be extremely difficult. In this case, investigators ultimately concluded that no fingerprint evidence of sufficient value existed to advance the investigation. They also searched for footwear impressions, another common source of investigative leads. Floors sometimes preserved dust patterns, blood transfers, or partial shoe prints that allow detectives to reconstruct movements during an attack. Here again, the evidence proved frustratingly limited. No clear shoe impressions emerged that could identify or even characterize the attacker's footwear. Every missing forensic clue narrowed the investigative path. Instead of accumulating evidence pointing toward a suspect, detectives found themselves eliminating possibilities without discovering new ones. The murder weapon represented another major obstacle. Based upon the characteristics of the wounds, forensic specialists concluded that the injuries were consistent with a large pair of scissors, a paper knife, or another similar single-edged blade. The exact weapon, however, remained unknown because it was never recovered. This absence carried enormous investigative consequences. Had the weapon been found, it might have preserved fingerprints, microscopic fibers, biological traces, or manufacturing characteristics linking it to a particular owner or location. Instead, investigators were forced to rely entirely upon the wounds themselves to estimate the type of instrument used. The weapon had effectively disappeared alongside its owner. Detectives next focused on reconstructing the killer's movements through the building. The physical layout of the bookstore became particularly important. Father Sergio Bafasai had initially attempted to enter through the rear entrance, repeatedly knocking without receiving a response. Investigators later established that this rear door remained locked from the inside. That detail significantly narrowed the possibilities. If the rear entrance had remained secured while Father Bafasai stood outside knocking, then the assailant almost certainly had not escaped through that route. Instead, investigators concluded that the killer most likely exited through the bookstore's front entrance only moments before the body was discovered. This conclusion carried unsettling implications. The front door opened directly onto Via del Proconsolo, one of the busiest historic streets in central Florence. Whoever committed the murder almost certainly stepped into an ordinary urban environment filled with pedestrians beginning their day. There was no need for dramatic escape routes, hidden vehicles, or elaborate disguises. Simply walking away calmly would likely have attracted no attention whatsoever. The city itself provided anonymity. Detectives, therefore, turned their attention toward eyewitness testimony, hoping that someone outside the bookstore had unknowingly observed the killer leaving the scene. Among all witness statements collected during the investigation, one account immediately stood apart. A witness reported seeing John Franco entering the bookstore at approximately 8:30, accompanied by an unidentified individual with long hair. This observation became one of the most important leads available to investigators because it represented the final confirmed sighting of John Franco alive. Unfortunately, it was also among the least complete. The witness could not determine whether the individual was male or female. Distance prevented identification of facial features. No detailed description of clothing, age, or physical build could be established with certainty beyond the presence of long hair. Nevertheless, police recognized the importance of locating this individual. They publicized the description, reviewed numerous statements, and attempted to identify anyone matching the limited information available. Despite these efforts, the person was never conclusively identified. Decades later, the mysterious long-haired figure remains one of the central unanswered questions of the case. Investigators have never been able to establish whether this person was the killer, an innocent customer, a casual acquaintance, or someone entirely unrelated to the crime. Their identity vanished almost as completely as the murderer. Another witness account initially appeared promising, but ultimately led nowhere. Several people recalled seeing a middle-aged woman lingering near the bookstore while holding her hands together in front of her body. Suspicion increased dramatically after investigators discovered fresh blood on the woman's umbrella. Given the timing and proximity to the murder scene, detectives understandably considered her a potentially significant witness or even a suspect. The umbrella was subjected to forensic examination using the methods available at the time. The results quickly altered the direction of the investigation. Testing demonstrated that the blood found on the umbrella did not belong to Gianfranco Cacchini. Furthermore, the woman provided a clear alibi accounting for her movements, with no evidence connecting her to the homicide. Investigators eliminated her from the list of suspects. Although disappointing from an investigative standpoint, this decision reflected an important principle of responsible criminal inquiry. Suspicion alone cannot substitute for evidence. Once the available facts contradicted initial assumptions, detectives moved on rather than forcing the evidence to support a preferred theory. During the detailed examination of the bookstore, investigators encountered another peculiar element that has continued to fascinate observers ever since. Inside a notebook, they found 3 handwritten words, Uma harem Uma. At first glance, the phrase appeared meaningless. Yet because no obvious explanation existed, detectives considered whether it might somehow relate to the murder. Specialists from several disciplines were consulted. Linguists examined the wording in search of recognizable language patterns. Religious scholars explored possible theological or cultural references. Cryptography experts considered whether the phrase represented some form of coded communication. Over the years, several interpretations emerged. Some observers suggested a connection to Uma, a name associated with the Hindu goddess Parvati. Others speculated about possible references to religious sites or ceremonial terminology. Still others argued that the phrase might simply be an unrelated personal note with no connection whatsoever to the homicide. Despite years of analysis, no expert succeeded in demonstrating a definitive meaning or proving any relationship between the phrase and Gianfranco's death. As a result, Uma harem Uma remains one of the investigation's enduring mysteries, interesting enough to attract attention but insufficient to advance the search for the killer. As physical evidence failed to produce a suspect, investigators broadened their examination toward possible motives. The first theory addressed the most obvious possibility, robbery. This hypothesis was quickly discarded. Money remained inside the bookstore. Merchandise had not been stolen. Nothing suggested that financial gain motivated the attack. Moreover, the sheer violence of 27 stab wounds seemed grossly disproportionate to a failed theft. Detectives therefore shifted their attention toward the possibility that the victim himself had been the intended target. This line of reasoning naturally raised another question. Why Gianfranco? His presence in the bookstore that morning resulted entirely from an unexpected substitution. Investigators therefore explored the possibility that the attacker somehow knew Gianfranco would be working alone despite the schedule change. If true, such knowledge implied familiarity either with Gianfranco personally, with the bookstore's operations, or with someone capable of learning about staffing arrangements. Yet no evidence emerged demonstrating exactly how such information could have been obtained. The theory remained plausible but unproven. Another investigative avenue considered the unusual environment in which the crime occurred. Because the bookstore specialized in religious materials and served clergy, detectives examined whether the homicide might have involved religious extremism or individuals displaying unusual spiritual beliefs. This possibility received additional attention because Gianfranco had reportedly told his wife before his death that certain visitors to the bookstore caused him concern. According to the available information, he believed some customers might have been connected with unusual rituals or so-called black masses. Investigators treated this statement seriously enough to examine the possibility carefully. However, despite their efforts, No evidence established any connection between those concerns and the murder itself. Once again, suspicion could not be transformed into proof. As months gradually became years, the investigation reached an increasingly frustrating pattern. Every promising lead eventually dissolved. The physical evidence identified no suspect. The witnesses could not provide definitive identification. The murder weapon remained missing. The mysterious notebook phrase resisted interpretation. The unidentified, long-haired individual disappeared from traceable history. The woman with the blood-stained umbrella proved unrelated. Each unanswered question generated another, while none supplied the evidence necessary for prosecution. Investigators continued reviewing the case over time, hoping advances in forensic science or renewed public attention might reveal something previously overlooked. Yet the essential obstacles remained unchanged. There was no identifiable suspect, no reliable forensic link, and no clear motive capable of explaining why a retired printer working part-time in a religious bookstore became the victim of such extraordinary violence. The investigation, therefore, entered the difficult category known throughout criminal justice systems as a cold case. The files remained open, the evidence preserved where possible, and the questions unanswered. What detectives possessed was an exceptionally detailed understanding of the crime scene itself. They knew approximately when the attack occurred. They understood that the assault had likely begun suddenly from behind. They recognized that the killer almost certainly escaped through the front entrance within minutes of Father Sergio Bafasai's arrival. They could identify the probable types of weapon used. They could explain why robbery seemed unlikely. Yet despite reconstructing the mechanics of the crime with remarkable precision, they could not answer the most fundamental question in any homicide investigation: who committed it? That single missing answer transformed every carefully documented fact into pieces of a puzzle whose final image has never been revealed. As the first months of the investigation gave way to years, detectives faced a reality that is familiar in only the most difficult homicide cases. The question was no longer simply who had killed Gianfranco Cacchini. Instead, investigators were forced to ask whether the available evidence would ever allow them to answer that question at all. Every major inquiry had been pursued. Witnesses had been interviewed. The crime scene had been examined repeatedly. Forensic evidence had been analyzed using the technology available in 1995. Numerous leads had been investigated. Yet despite these efforts, no suspect emerged with evidence strong enough to support criminal charges. The investigation gradually shifted from searching for a likely offender to testing every conceivable explanation against a frustrating absence of proof. It became a process of eliminating possibilities rather than confirming one. Among the earliest theories considered was robbery. At first glance, a violent attack inside a commercial establishment naturally invites questions about theft. Small bookstores typically contain cash, and crimes committed during opening hours occasionally involve offenders seeking money before customers arrive. However, nearly every observable fact inside the Manueli bookstore contradicted that explanation. The money remained where it should have been. Merchandise had not disappeared. Shelves filled with religious books, devotional objects, rosaries, and other items showed no indication that someone had searched through the premises looking for valuables. Even more significant was the extraordinary level of violence inflicted upon Gianfranco. 27 stab wounds represented an intensity that investigators considered highly inconsistent with an ordinary robbery. While robberies can certainly become violent, they usually involve force intended to overcome resistance or facilitate escape. Here, the attack continued long after the victim had apparently lost the ability to defend himself. The brutality seemed disconnected from financial gain. Detectives therefore concluded that robbery, while initially examined, could not satisfactorily explain either the physical evidence or the overall condition of the crime scene. Once robbery was effectively dismissed, attention shifted toward a more personal possibility. Could Gianfranco himself have been the intended target? This theory immediately raised another series of difficult questions because virtually nothing in the documented information about his life suggested obvious personal enemies. He was a retired art printer who had accepted part-time employment in a religious bookstore after leaving his long career. He lived with his family in Sesto Fiorentino, was married, and had 2 children. Friends and relatives were not known to describe ongoing disputes capable of explaining such extreme violence. Yet investigators could not ignore one particularly significant fact. Gianfranco should not have been working that morning. His presence inside the bookstore resulted entirely from an unexpected change in schedule after the owner needed to accompany his daughter to an eye appointment. This circumstance transformed the timing of the murder into one of the investigation's most important unanswered questions. Detectives considered whether the killer possessed advanced knowledge that Gianfranco would be alone in the bookstore despite the last-minute alteration of staffing. If the answer was yes, then the attacker likely knew either Gianfranco personally, understood the bookstore's daily operations, or obtained information from someone familiar with the schedule. Such knowledge would significantly narrow the range of possible suspects. However, proving that such knowledge actually existed proved impossible. There was no witness who could testify that someone had inquired about Gianfranco's schedule. No documented communication revealed that his substitution had been shared beyond those directly involved. No physical evidence connected any individual to advance planning. Consequently, while investigators regarded this as one of the strongest theoretical explanations, it remained precisely that, a theory. It explained certain aspects of the crime, but could not identify the person responsible. The unidentified, long-haired individual naturally occupied a central position within this line of reasoning. Because a witness had reported seeing Gianfranco entering the bookstore accompanied by someone whose gender could not be determined. Investigators viewed this individual as potentially crucial. If the observation accurately represented the final moments before the attack, then locating the long-haired person might have transformed the investigation completely. Police reviewed witness statements, examined possible identities, and attempted to match the limited description against numerous individuals. Unfortunately, the description itself remained frustratingly vague. Long hair alone could not establish identity. The witness had been unable to provide enough additional detail regarding age, clothing, facial appearance, or other distinguishing characteristics. Without those elements, investigators could neither identify the individual nor exclude them from suspicion. The mystery therefore endured. Decades later, the long-haired figure remains perhaps the single most significant unidentified person connected with the case. Whether that individual was the killer, a witness, or someone entirely unrelated has never been established. Another theory emerged from Gianfranco's own reported observations before his death. According to the information available to investigators, he had told his wife that certain customers visiting the bookstore made him uneasy. Specifically, he reportedly suspected that some individuals might have been connected with unusual religious rituals or what he described as black masses. Given the specialized nature of the bookstore, detectives considered whether these comments deserved closer examination. The Manueli bookstore served priests, nuns, church employees, and members of the public seeking religious materials. Its location inside the Curia Arcivescovile naturally placed it within an environment closely associated with the Catholic Church. Any suggestion involving unconventional religious practices therefore attracted investigative interest. Detectives explored the possibility that John Franco's concerns reflected genuine encounters with individuals displaying disturbing behavior. If so, perhaps one of those encounters eventually escalated into violence. Yet responsible criminal investigation requires evidence rather than speculation. Although John Franco's reported comments offered one possible avenue of inquiry, detectives ultimately found nothing capable of substantiating the theory. No witness confirmed that threatening confrontations had occurred. No physical evidence connected any particular visitor to the homicide. No documented incidents demonstrated that unusual religious activities had any relationship to the events of March 24, 1995. As a result, the possibility of religious extremism remained an investigative hypothesis, but never advanced into a supported conclusion. Another unusual feature that continued attracting attention was the mysterious notebook containing the handwritten phrase, Umma Haram Umma. Because the words appeared unusual and lacked an immediately recognizable meaning, they naturally invited speculation. Linguists, religious scholars, and cryptography specialists all examined the phrase in an effort to determine whether it concealed information relevant to the homicide. Several interpretations emerged during those examinations. Some observers noted that Uma is associated with the Hindu goddess Parvati, leading to suggestions of possible religious symbolism. Others speculated about connections to temples or foreign languages. Still others argued that the phrase may have been entirely unrelated to the crime and merely represented a personal notation whose original context had been lost. Despite years of analysis, no explanation gained sufficient evidentiary support to influence the investigation decisively. The notebook therefore joined the growing collection of unresolved elements surrounding the case. It remained interesting, perhaps even important, but impossible to interpret with confidence. Meanwhile, another early suspicion had already been resolved. The middle-aged woman seen carrying an umbrella with fresh blood upon it initially appeared to represent a potentially significant lead. Investigators understandably questioned whether someone standing near the bookstore shortly after the estimated time of the murder might possess crucial information. The discovery of blood increased those suspicions dramatically. Yet scientific testing demonstrated that the blood found on the umbrella did not belong to Gianfranco Culquini. Equally important, the woman established a credible alibi accounting for her activities. Once those facts became clear, investigators eliminated her from the inquiry. Although disappointing, this outcome reflected the disciplined approach required in criminal investigations. Apparent coincidences can easily appear meaningful until objective evidence demonstrates otherwise. In this instance, the available facts simply did not support continuing suspicion. As years passed without an arrest, the investigation increasingly confronted the limitations of the available forensic evidence. The murder weapon had never been recovered. Without it, investigators lost one of the most valuable opportunities to identify the attacker through fingerprints, trace materials, or other physical evidence. No usable fingerprints recovered from the bookstore could identify an unknown suspect. No clear footwear impressions traced movements through the scene. Most significantly, the forensic technology available in 1995 failed to produce a usable DNA profile belonging to the killer. Modern audiences familiar with contemporary forensic science may wonder why DNA did not resolve the case. The answer lies not in investigative neglect, but in the technological realities of the period. Many of the advanced analytical techniques routinely employed decades later were either unavailable or insufficiently developed when John Franco was murdered. Consequently, evidence that might potentially yield information today could not necessarily do so in 1995. This limitation contributed significantly to the case's gradual transition into a cold case. unlike investigations that end with dramatic arrests or courtroom testimony. The Gianfranco Cacchini investigation eventually reached a point where detectives had exhausted every available avenue without obtaining enough evidence to identify a suspect. There was no confession. No eyewitness capable of naming the attacker came forward. No forensic breakthrough established an individual's presence during the murder. The investigation remained open in principle, but its momentum inevitably slowed as immediate leads disappeared. This transition carried important legal consequences. Criminal prosecutions require identifiable defendants. Court cannot try unknown individuals. Without a suspect, prosecutors had no opportunity to present evidence before a judge or jury. Consequently, the case never entered the courtroom. There was no indictment announcing formal criminal charges. No defense attorneys challenged the evidence. No witnesses testified under oath regarding the identity of the killer. No verdict, whether guilty or not guilty, could ever be delivered because no accused person existed to stand trial. This absence of judicial proceedings distinguishes the case from many famous criminal investigations. Public attention often focuses on dramatic courtroom confrontations, cross-examinations, and verdicts. In Gianfranco's case, none of those events occurred. The criminal justice process effectively halted at the investigative stage. Detectives continued searching for answers, but without sufficient evidence identifying a suspect. The judicial system could not proceed further. The murder therefore remained legally unresolved. There was no conviction because there was never a prosecution. There was no acquittal because no defendant appeared before the court. Instead, the official record reflected only an unsolved homicide whose perpetrator remained unknown. Over the following decades, the case continued to occupy a unique position within Florence's criminal history. It was remembered not because investigators ignored it, but because they confronted an exceptionally difficult combination of circumstances. The attack occurred within an extraordinarily brief period of approximately 15 minutes. The killer apparently escaped immediately through the front entrance into one of the city's busiest historic districts. The weapon disappeared permanently. The available forensic evidence proved insufficient to establish identity. The most significant witness observed only a long-haired individual whose gender could not even be determined. Other intriguing details, including the notebook phrase, Uma harem Uma, and Gianfranco's reported concerns regarding unusual visitors, generated possibilities without producing proof. Each clue pointed toward potential explanations while simultaneously resisting definitive interpretation. As the investigation entered its third decade, many observers began viewing the case not simply as an unsolved murder, but as a study in the limitations of criminal investigation itself. Detectives reconstructed the probable sequence of events with considerable precision. They identified likely methods of attack, probable escape routes, and the approximate timeline. They carefully tested competing theories against the available evidence and rejected those unsupported by facts. Yet despite that thoroughness, the essential question remained unanswered. Who killed Gianfranco Cacchini? The tragedy of the investigation lies not in a lack of effort, but in the absence of evidence capable of crossing the threshold required by law. Criminal justice systems cannot rely upon intuition, probability, or public speculation. They require proof. In Gianfranco's case, proof remained painfully out of reach. By the time the investigation settled into the category of a cold case, detectives possessed numerous fragments of a story but lacked the single piece capable of bringing those fragments together. The result was a homicide investigation without a trial, a victim without judicial resolution, and a mystery that continued to challenge every person who examined the evidence. More than 30 years after Gianfranco accepted what should have been an ordinary substitute shift, The legal outcome of his case remains exactly as it was in the days immediately following his death. No identified suspect, no prosecution, no conviction, and no final answer. The silence that greeted Father Sergio Bafasai's knocks on the bookstore door that morning has, in many respects, continued to echo throughout the investigation ever since. More than 3 decades have passed since the morning of March 24, 1995. Yet the murder of Gianfranco Cacchini remains suspended in an uncomfortable space between memory and uncertainty. Florence has continued to evolve. Millions of visitors have walked the same historic streets, admired the same Renaissance architecture, and passed through Via del Proconsolo without realizing that one of the city's most enduring unsolved crimes unfolded only a short distance away. The bookstores have welcomed new customers. The churches have continued their daily services. And ordinary life has moved forward exactly as it always does. Cities possess an extraordinary ability to continue functioning after tragedy. Buildings remain standing. Streets remain busy. New generations gradually replace old ones. But unresolved crimes do not disappear simply because time passes. Instead, they linger quietly beneath the surface, waiting for someone to ask the same questions once again. For investigators, cold cases represent more than old files stored in archives. They are reminders that justice is sometimes delayed not by a lack of commitment, but by the simple absence of evidence capable of revealing the truth. The Gianfranco Cacchini investigation illustrates this reality with unusual clarity. Detectives were able to establish a remarkably detailed reconstruction of the crime itself. They determined approximately when the attack occurred. They understood that the assault was probably sudden and that Gianfranco likely had little opportunity to defend himself. They concluded that the killer almost certainly left through the front entrance because the rear door remained locked from the inside. They identified the probable types of weapon capable of producing the wounds. They examined every available witness statement, every physical clue, and every plausible theory. Yet despite all of that work, the investigation never crossed the invisible line separating knowledge from certainty. They understood many aspects of how the crime happened. They never discovered who committed it. That distinction defines countless unsolved homicide investigations throughout the world. It is entirely possible to reconstruct the mechanics of a crime while remaining unable to identify the individual responsible. In Gianfranco's case, every important clue seemed to stop just short of providing the answer investigators needed. Consider the mysterious long-haired individual seen entering the bookstore alongside Gianfranco at approximately 8:30 that morning. Decades later, this unidentified figure continues to occupy a central place in every discussion of the case. If that person was merely another customer, then perhaps they unknowingly crossed paths with a murderer only moments before the attack. If they were personally acquainted with Gianfranco, they might have possessed information capable of explaining the events that followed. If they were the killer, then they disappeared into Florence almost immediately after committing the crime. The difficulty is that no available evidence establishes which possibility is correct. The witness who observed the encounter could describe only one distinguishing characteristic: long hair. Gender could not be determined. Identity could not be established. No additional witness filled the gaps left by that brief observation. As a result, one of the investigation's most important leads also became one of its greatest frustrations. Equally perplexing is the apparent contradiction between the violence of the attack and the condition of the bookstore. 27 stab wounds suggest overwhelming aggression, yet the surrounding environment displayed remarkably little disruption. Shelves remained orderly. Merchandise stayed in place. Money was left untouched. There were no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle extending throughout the shop. This contrast continues to challenge simple explanations. If robbery was not the motive, why was nothing taken? If personal hatred motivated the attack, what evidence supports that conclusion? If Gianfranco was specifically targeted, how did the killer know he would be working that morning despite the unexpected schedule change? Every answer seems to generate another question rather than resolving the mystery. The timing itself remains one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire case. Approximately 15 minutes separate the last confirmed sighting of Gianfranco alive from the discovery of his body. Within that narrow window, an individual entered or remained inside the bookstore, launched a fatal attack, inflicted 27 stab wounds, departed through the front entrance, and vanished into one of Italy's most famous historic cities without being identified. It is an astonishing sequence when viewed in retrospect. The brevity of the timeline suggests preparation. Yet preparation alone does not identify the person responsible. It explains efficiency, but not identity. It demonstrates opportunity, but not motive. The investigation also reminds us how profoundly criminal investigations depend upon technology. Available at the time a crime occurs. In 1995, forensic science had already become an essential investigative tool. But many of the techniques considered routine today either did not exist or lacked the sensitivity necessary to analyze extremely limited biological material. Detectives searched for fingerprints capable of identifying the killer and found none of sufficient value. They searched for usable DNA and could not recover evidence capable of revealing an unknown suspect. The murder weapon disappeared before it could be examined. These limitations were not the result of investigative failure. They reflected the scientific realities of the era. For that reason, some investigators and observers have continued to express cautious hope that preserved evidence, if it still exists in suitable condition, could someday benefit from advances in forensic technology. Such hope must remain measured because there is no guarantee that modern techniques will uncover information unavailable in 1995. Nevertheless, history has demonstrated that some cold cases once considered impossible have eventually been solved through scientific developments unimaginable at the time of the original investigation. Whether that will ever happen in Gianfranco's case remains unknown. Another enduring mystery is contained within 3 seemingly simple words written inside a notebook. Umaruma. Over the years, those words have inspired countless interpretations. Linguists searched for recognizable language structures. Religious scholars explored possible spiritual meanings. Cryptography experts examined the possibility of hidden messages or coded communication. None of those efforts produced a definitive explanation. Perhaps the phrase possessed enormous significance. Perhaps it had none at all. The investigation could never determine whether the notebook represented a genuine clue or an unrelated curiosity that happened to exist within the bookstore. Unsolved cases often become surrounded by details that appear meaningful precisely because no one can explain them. Without context, even ordinary objects acquire an aura of mystery. Yet responsible investigation requires acknowledging uncertainty rather than replacing it with speculation. Uma harem uma, therefore, remains exactly what it has always been, an unresolved element whose connection to the homicide cannot be established. The same cautious approach applies to Gianfranco's reported concerns about certain visitors to the bookstore. According to the available information, he had expressed unease to his wife regarding individuals he believed might be associated with unusual rituals or so-called black masses. Detectives considered that possibility because it deserved investigation. However, consideration does not equal confirmation. Despite examining the idea, investigators discovered no evidence linking those concerns directly to the murder. In the years since, This aspect of the case has sometimes attracted public fascination because it appears unusual. Yet the historical record remains clear. No factual evidence has demonstrated that such activities played any role in Gianfranco's death. Distinguishing between verified facts and unresolved speculation remains essential, particularly in cases that continue to inspire public interest decades after they occurred. Perhaps the most powerful lesson emerging from the Gianfranco Cacchini case concerns the victims of unsolved crimes and the families left behind. When a homicide results in arrest, trial, and conviction, the legal process eventually reaches a conclusion, even if emotional healing remains impossible. An unsolved homicide offers no such ending. Instead, it leaves relatives confronting unanswered questions year after year. They know what happened to someone they loved. They know when it happened and where it happened. What they do not know is why it happened or who bears responsibility. That uncertainty becomes part of the family's history. Every anniversary brings not only memories of loss, but also the awareness that justice remains incomplete. Gianfranco's identity should therefore not be reduced merely to that of an unsolved murder victim. Before the investigation, before the headlines, before the police reports, he was a husband, a father, and a retired craftsman who had spent decades working in the precise world of printing. After retirement, he continued contributing to his community through quiet part-time work in a religious bookstore. On the morning of March 24, 1995, he accepted what appeared to be an ordinary request to substitute for a colleague. There is something profoundly human about that simple decision. It reflects generosity rather than obligation. It was an act so commonplace that no one could have imagined its consequences. Yet history often turns upon moments that seem insignificant while they occur. A changed work schedule, an earlier opening time, a witness noticing someone with long hair, a priest arriving 15 minutes later than another customer might have. Each detail appears ordinary in isolation. Together, they form the final chapter of Gianfranco's life and the beginning of one of Florence's most enduring mysteries. More than 30 years later, the official outcome remains unchanged. No suspect has been identified. No one has been prosecuted. No one has been convicted. The murder weapon has never been recovered. The unidentified, long-haired individual has never been conclusively located. The meaning of Umma Harum Umma remains unresolved. The questions that confronted investigators in 1995 continue to confront anyone who studies the case. Today, who entered that bookstore with Gianfranco? Was the attack planned specifically for him? Or did circumstances unexpectedly place him in the killer's path? Why was such extraordinary violence directed toward a man whose life appeared so ordinary? And perhaps most importantly, can modern investigative techniques someday reveal what decades of traditional investigation could not? Those questions remain unanswered, but they also explain why Gianfranco Cacchini's story continues to be remembered. It is not remembered because of sensationalism or spectacle. It endures because it reminds us that some of the most troubling mysteries arise not from complicated conspiracies or famous public figures, but from the sudden destruction of an ordinary life. Behind every cold case file is a person whose future ended without explanation. Behind every unanswered question is a family that never received complete answers. Behind every investigation that reaches a standstill remains the possibility, however small, that one overlooked detail, one forgotten memory, or one future scientific breakthrough could finally illuminate what has remained hidden for so long. Until that day arrives, if it ever does, the story of Gianfranco Cacchini remains unfinished. It begins with a quiet morning inside a peaceful religious bookstore and ends, for now, with silence. Not the silence of forgotten history, but the silence of a question that has never been answered. Somewhere within those missing 15 minutes lies the truth of what happened on March 24, 1995. The investigation has preserved the facts. Time has preserved the mystery. And as long as the identity of Gianfranco Cacchini's killer remains unknown, those 15 minutes will continue to stand as one of Florence's most haunting and enduring unsolved chapters. More than 30 years after the death of Gianfranco Cacchini, the unanswered questions surrounding his murder remain as persistent as they were on the morning when investigators first entered the Manueli bookstore. Time has changed many things in Florence, but it has not changed the central mystery at the heart of this case. A man walked into a quiet religious bookstore, a place considered peaceful and secure, and within minutes his life was taken in an act of extreme violence. The person responsible disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of evidence, incomplete memories, and a collection of unanswered questions that have resisted every attempt to find a solution. The passing of years has not erased the significance of what happened. Instead, it has transformed the murder of Gianfranco Cacchini into one of Florence's most enduring cold cases. A case remembered not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the ordinary life that was suddenly and inexplicably destroyed. Gianfranco was not a person who sought attention. His life had been defined by work, family, and routine. For decades, he had worked as an art printer, a profession requiring precision, patience, and attention to detail. After retirement, he could have chosen a quieter existence away from professional responsibilities. Instead, he continued contributing his time and experience by working part-time at the Manueli bookstore. It was a modest role, but one that placed him in contact with the community surrounding the Curia of Florence. The bookstore was not a place associated with danger. It was a place of books, religious objects, and daily interactions with priests, nuns, and visitors searching for spiritual materials. The idea that such a location could become the scene of a violent homicide was difficult for many people to comprehend. The tragedy was made even more profound by the circumstances of that specific morning. Gianfranco was not originally scheduled to work. His presence behind the counter was the result of a simple request for help. The bookstore owner needed to accompany his daughter to an eye appointment, and Gianfranco agreed to replace him. It was a small act of cooperation, the kind of ordinary favor that happens every day between colleagues and acquaintances. Yet that unexpected change created one of the most haunting questions in the investigation. How could the killer have known he would be there? If the attack was planned, someone may have possessed information about that altered schedule. If the murderer acted by coincidence, then the timing was extraordinarily unusual. Investigators examined this question repeatedly, but the answer remained hidden. The uncertainty surrounding that detail became one of the defining elements of the case. The final confirmed moments of Gianfranco's life have been reconstructed only through limited information. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, he was seen entering the bookstore accompanied by an unidentified person with long hair. That brief observation would later become one of the most important pieces of testimony in the entire investigation. Yet it was also one of the most frustrating. The witness could not determine whether the person was male or female. There was no reliable description of facial features. No additional information allowed investigators to establish the identity of that individual. Over time, the unknown person became a symbol of the unanswered nature of the case. Somewhere between ordinary routine and tragedy, someone entered Gianfranco's final moments. And history has never revealed who that person was. The attack itself remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. 27 stab wounds were inflicted upon Gianfranco, yet the surrounding bookstore showed little evidence of a prolonged struggle. The contradiction continues to trouble anyone who studies the case. The violence was extraordinary, but the scene was strangely controlled. The shelves remained intact. The merchandise was not taken. The money was untouched. There was no clear indication of a robbery or a chaotic confrontation. Instead, investigators were left with the impression of a sudden attack in which Gianfranco had almost no chance to react. The absence of defensive wounds suggested that he may have been surprised from behind, possibly before he even understood he was in danger. This interpretation made the crime even more difficult to understand because it suggested familiarity, preparation, or at least a significant advantage held by the attacker. The investigation that followed demonstrated both the dedication of law enforcement and the limitations faced by investigators when evidence is scarce. Every available lead was examined. Every unusual detail was considered. The bloodstain found on the nearby chair was analyzed as investigators attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events. The possibility of robbery was examined and rejected because nothing had been stolen. The possibility of a personal motive was explored, yet no clear conflict or enemy emerged. The possibility of a connection to unusual religious activities was considered because of the bookstore's environment and Gianfranco's reported concerns about certain visitors. But no evidence confirmed such a connection. The mysterious phrase, Umma Haram Umma, was investigated, analyzed, and discussed, but its meaning remained unknown. Each path offered possibilities, but never produced certainty. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the case is that investigators were not left with nothing. They were left with many pieces that never formed a complete picture. They knew the approximate timeline. They understood the likely method of attack. They identified probable escape routes. They determined that the killer likely left through the front entrance moments before Father Sergio Bafasai discovered the body. They knew the rear entrance remained locked from the inside. They knew the murder weapon was never recovered. They knew the crime was unlikely to have been motivated by theft. Yet knowledge of these details could not answer the most important question: who was responsible? In criminal investigations, the difference between suspicion and proof is absolute. A theory may appear convincing. A person may seem unusual. A coincidence may appear meaningful. But without evidence capable of establishing responsibility beyond reasonable doubt, no prosecution can move forward. The Gianfranco Cacchini case demonstrates that reality. There are questions, but no accused individual. There are theories, but no conviction. There was an investigation, but no trial. For that reason, the judicial chapter of the case remains empty. No defendant ever stood before a court. No witnesses testified against a named suspect. No verdict was delivered. The legal system was unable to provide the conclusion that Gianfranco's family and those who cared about him deserved, because the identity of the person responsible was never established. For the family of a homicide victim, an unsolved case creates a particular kind of pain. The loss itself is devastating, but uncertainty adds another layer of suffering. There is no final explanation, no complete account of why someone was targeted, no moment when responsibility is officially assigned. Instead, the unanswered questions remain present year after year. The victim's memory continues, but the circumstances surrounding his death remain incomplete. Gianfranco's story is therefore not only about a murder investigation. It is also about a person whose life existed before the crime. He was a husband. He was a father. He was a craftsman who spent decades mastering his profession. He was someone who agreed to help a colleague on an ordinary morning. Remembering those details is essential because cold cases can sometimes reduce victims to the circumstances of their deaths. But Gianfranco Cacchini was more than the mystery surrounding his final moments. He was a person with a history, relationships, and a life that extended far beyond the crime scene. The continuing interest in this case does not come from the violence alone. It comes from the contrast between the ordinary and the impossible. A quiet bookstore inside a religious institution. A retired worker beginning what should have been a normal day. A brief change in schedule. A 15-minute window. A person seen entering with him but never identified. A murderer who vanished. These elements combine to create a mystery that has remained unresolved despite decades of attention. The case also represents a broader truth about unsolved crimes. Time can weaken memories, change communities, and make investigations increasingly difficult. Witnesses may forget details. Evidence may become harder to analyze. The distance between the crime and the present grows larger every year. Yet time does not erase the importance of seeking answers. Advances in forensic science continue to transform old investigations around the world, offering possibilities that did not exist when many crimes first occurred. Whether such progress will ever provide answers in John Franco's case remains unknown. The possibility exists, but the future cannot be predicted. For now, the case remains exactly where it has been for decades, unresolved. The identity of the killer remains unknown. The motive remains uncertain. The meaning of the remaining clues remains debated. The silence that followed the murder has never been completely broken. But the absence of a solution does not mean the story has lost importance. In many ways, the continued remembrance of Gianfranco Cacchini represents a refusal to allow an unanswered case to become a forgotten one. Every cold case carries the same fundamental message. Behind the evidence, behind the reports, behind the unanswered questions, there is a human being whose life mattered. Gianfranco's death created a mystery, but his life created memories. Those memories are what remain beyond the investigation. The final chapter of the case has not yet been written. Somewhere within the surviving evidence, within forgotten details, or perhaps within information that has never been revealed, the possibility of an answer remains. Until that answer is found, the murder of Gianfranco Cacchini will continue to stand as one of Florence's most haunting mysteries. It remains the story of a peaceful place transformed by violence, of a family left without complete answers, and of a question that has endured for decades. Who entered the Manueli bookstore that morning? And what truly happened during those final 15 minutes before the truth disappeared forever?